Love Takes a Tumble. A midlife meet cute romance. Written by Susanne Ash. Please like and subscribe. Chapter 1. The morning air hung thick with salt and possibility as Audrey Whitaker made her way down to the beach. Dawn had barely broken, casting the world in watercolor hues of pink and lavender that seemed to soften the edges of her thoughts. She'd always been an early riser. A habit formed through decades of opening the library before the rest of the world had properly woken. But here on Palmar Island, morning felt different. Sacred, somehow. She stepped onto the cool sand, her toes curling into its silky texture. 2 weeks she'd been at the Pelican Inn, and each morning began with a solitary walk as the sun climbed higher, notebook tucked under her arm, pen ready to capture whatever wisps of inspiration the ocean might offer. It had become her ritual, her quiet defiance against the voice that still echoed in her head. Her mother's voice. "This writing business is just a hobby, Audrey. Not something to build a life around." The tide was pulling back, revealing a stretch of wet sand perfect for walking. Audrey adjusted her light cardigan against the morning breeze and began to stroll, her eyes tracking the delicate patterns left by the retreating waves. 49 years old and only now learning to put herself first. The thought still felt foreign, almost rebellious. She opened her notebook, flipping past pages filled with her neat handwriting. Character sketches, dialogue fragments, scenes that refused to connect despite her best efforts. The novel was coming, slowly, stubbornly, but it was coming. After 3 decades of helping others find their stories in the hushed corners of her library, she was finally writing her own. If only she could silence the doubt that followed her like a shadow. A sandpiper darted past, its thin legs a blur as it chased the receding water. Audrey smiled, reminded of herself. Always chasing something that seemed to be constantly moving just beyond reach. Perfect metaphor material. She quickly jotted it down, her handwriting less precise than usual as she tried to capture the thought before it evaporated like morning mist. 3 months, she whispered to herself, the sound instantly carried away by the ocean breeze. That's all you need. 3 months at the Pelican Inn to finish her manuscript. 3 months to prove to herself, and perhaps, in some lingering, childish way, to her mother's memory, that she wasn't wasting her time. That the stories she'd carried inside her all these years deserved to exist outside the confines of her mind. The innkeepers, Elise and Jacob, had been unexpectedly kind when she'd explained her purpose in booking a long-term stay. Not that she'd told them everything. She hadn't mentioned the years spent caring for her increasingly bitter mother back home in Ohio. Or the dreams deferred for so long they'd nearly suffocated. Not when she was facing the terrifying freedom that came with inheritance money and no one left to disapprove of how she spent it. No, she'd simply said she was writing a book. And somehow, in their eyes, that had made her a real writer. Audrey paused, realizing she'd walked farther than usual, past the curve where the beach bent toward the old lighthouse. The sun had climbed higher, burning away the morning's gentle palette and replacing it with the stark clarity of full daylight. She should head back soon, get some actual writing done rather than just thinking about writing. That had always been her problem. Thinking rather than doing. Planning rather than living. Her fingers brushed against the silver strands now liberally threaded through her chestnut hair. Not that there was much living left to do at her age. She'd had her chance, hadn't she? Made her choices. Or rather, let circumstance choose for her. Now it was about making the most of what remained. Finding purpose in words, if not in connections. A flash of something caught her eye. A piece of driftwood lay half buried in the sand, its shape twisted into something almost sculptural by years of ocean currents. Perfect for the mantelpiece in her room, a little souvenir of morning walks and new beginnings. She bent to examine it, her thoughts already drifting back to her protagonist's dilemma in Chapter 12, the words forming and reforming in her mind as she reached for the weathered wood. She never noticed how her foot caught in the hollow beneath the driftwood, never registered the shift in her balance until it was too late. The world tilted abruptly, the sky and sea changing places in a disorienting blur. Her notebook went flying as her arms windmilled uselessly, and then came the jolt of impact. her ankle twisting beneath her with a sickening wrench as she tumbled into the sand. The pain was immediate and breathtaking. Audrey gasped, momentarily stunned by both the fall and the sharp throb radiating up from her ankle. Embarrassment followed swiftly, though there was no one around to witness her graceless tumble. She sat up slowly, sand clinging to her cardigan and hair, and gingerly touched her ankle. It was already beginning to swell, a bad sign. With a grimace, she attempted to stand and promptly sank back down as pain shot through her leg. "Well," she muttered to no one, "this is certainly not how I planned to spend my morning." The beach stretched empty in both directions, the tide creeping back in toward her feet. Her notebook lay a few feet away, pages fluttering in the breeze like the wings of some wounded bird. And the Pelican Inn was at least a quarter-mile back, suddenly seeming impossibly distant. For the first time since arriving on Palmar Island, Audrey felt acutely, uncomfortably alone. Audrey bit her lip against a wave of frustration. Of all the foolish, clumsy things to do. She'd prided herself on always being careful. She was the responsible one, the planner, the woman who never needed anyone's help. And now here she was, stranded on a beach with a rapidly swelling ankle, all because she'd been too lost in her own thoughts to watch where she was stepping. She'd have to find a way to make it back. The thought was mortifying, but she refused to sit helplessly waiting for rescue. Gathering her determination, she began to maneuver herself into a position where she might be able to stand, using the very piece of driftwood that had betrayed her as a makeshift support. "That looks like a bad idea." The deep voice startled her so badly she nearly toppled over again. Audrey's head jerked up to find a man standing a few feet away, watching her with an expression caught between concern and something that looked irritatingly like amusement. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with salt and pepper hair that the morning breeze had tousled into attractive disarray. The kind of man who looked entirely at home against the backdrop of sea and sky. And he was witnessing her at what was possibly her least dignified moment in years. "I'm fine," she said automatically, the words clipped and defensive. "Just taking a moment to rest." His eyebrows rose, the creases at the corners of his eyes deepening. "On the wet sand? With your ankle turning purple?" "It is not turning," she glanced down and winced. It was, in fact, starting to bruise rather spectacularly. "It's nothing serious." The man took a step closer, and Audrey noticed he carried a travel mug in one hand. An early riser too, perhaps. "You're staying at the Pelican Inn," he said, not a question but a statement. "Yes." She didn't ask how he knew. The inn was small, guests few enough that they'd all noted each other's presence at breakfast or in the garden. She had a vague recollection of seeing him on the porch 2 evenings ago, nursing a drink as the sun set. She hadn't paid much attention. Socializing wasn't why she'd come to Palmar Island. He set his mug in the sand and crouched beside her, his movements practiced and efficient. "I'm Harrison Tate. Most people call me Harry." His eyes were a deep blue, she realized, like the ocean just before a storm. "Let me take a look at that ankle. That's really not any sea." But his hands were already gently probing the injury, his touch surprisingly careful for someone with such weathered, capable hands. Audrey found herself momentarily at a loss for words, caught between indignation at his presumption and an odd sense of relief at not being alone anymore. "Not broken," he said after a moment. "But a nasty sprain. You need ice, elevation, and probably someone to check it's not worse than it looks." "Thank you for the diagnosis, doctor." The sarcasm slipped out before she could stop it. A corner of his mouth quirked up. "Firefighter, actually. Retired. But I've seen enough sprains to know you're not walking back on that." Of course he was a firefighter. The confident competence, the automatic assumption that she needed rescuing. It all made sense now. "Well, I appreciate your concern, but I can manage." Harry, sat back on his heels, regarding her steadily. "You planning to hobble a quarter-mile back to the inn?" Her cheeks burned. "If necessary." Sounds like a great way to get sand in an open wound and end up with an infection on top of that sprain. "I don't have any open. Yet." He stood, brushing sand from his knees. Look, I'm heading back to the inn anyway. Let me help you. Audrey pressed her lips together, weighing her limited options. Her ankle throbbed with increasing intensity, a reminder that stubborn independence might not be the wisest course right now. But accepting help from a stranger, especially one who looked at her with that mix of concern and amusement, felt like conceding something important. I'm Audrey, she said finally, the closest she could come to acceptance. Audrey Whitaker. Nice to meet you, Audrey Whitaker, he replied, and without further discussion, he bent and slid one arm under her knees, the other supporting her back. This is going to be easier than you hopping the whole way. Wait, you can't just, but the protest died in her throat as he lifted her effortlessly, cradling her against his chest as if she weighed nothing at all. The sudden proximity was overwhelming. The solid warmth of him, the faint scent of coffee and something woodsy, the steady beat of his heart against her shoulder. Her own heart gave a strange little flutter that she immediately attributed to surprise and nothing more. Your notebook, he said, nodding toward where it lay in the sand. Oh. She'd almost forgotten it in the commotion. Could you? Harrison bent carefully, maintaining his hold on her while somehow managing to scoop up the notebook with his free hand. He passed it to her with a small smile that softened the rugged planes of his face. Can't leave the important things behind. He reached down once more, retrieving his coffee mug from where he'd set it in the sand, managing to hold it with the same hand that supported her knees. And I'm not leaving my coffee either. Morning necessity. She clutched the notebook to her chest, suddenly self-conscious. It's just notes. Didn't look like just anything to me. He adjusted his grip on her and began walking toward the inn, his stride steady and unhurried. You a writer? Trying to be, she admitted, the words coming easier with her face turned slightly away from his. I used to be a librarian. Used to be? His voice rumbled close to her ear. I retired early. To write. The explanation felt inadequate, missing all the years of putting everyone else's needs before her own, of helping readers find the perfect book while her own story remained untold. It's a new chapter. Literally. Harrison's chest moved with what might have been a chuckle. I know something about new chapters. The understanding in his tone made her glance up, catching his gaze for a moment before quickly looking away. There was a weight behind his eyes that suggested he knew exactly what it was like to reinvent yourself when the life you'd planned suddenly veered into unfamiliar territory. The Pelican Inn gradually came into view. White clapboard gleaming in the morning sun, its wraparound porch and gabled roof a welcoming sight. Audrey tried to ignore how acutely aware she was of being carried, of the strange intimacy of having a stranger's arms around her. It had been a very long time since anyone had touched her with such casual confidence. Almost there, Harrison said, though whether he was reassuring her or himself wasn't clear. Think you can manage the stairs, or should I carry you all the way in? The thought of being carried through the inn's main entrance like some sort of distressed damsel made Audrey stiffen. The stairs will be fine. I'll just need something to lean on. You've got me, he said simply, and something in his matter-of-fact tone made that strange flutter return to her chest. This was ridiculous. She was nearly 50 years old, far too sensible to be affected by strong arms and kind eyes. She'd come to Palmar Island to write, not to be swept off her feet, literally or figuratively. Besides, men like Harrison Tate, with their hero complexes and easy charm, were decidedly not her type. If she even had a type anymore. Chapter 2. The screen door of the Pelican Inn squeaked as Harrison pushed it open, helping Audrey hop over the threshold. His arm was steady around her waist, bearing most of her weight as she grimaced with each careful step. Elise Oswald looked up from the reception desk, her expression shifting rapidly from welcome to concern. What happened? She hurried around the desk, dark curls bouncing, her quick eyes taking in Audrey's swollen ankle. Someone had a disagreement with a piece of driftwood, Harrison said. Ankle's pretty bad. I'm perfectly fine, Audrey insisted, her cheeks flushed. Just a minor sprain. Mr. Tate was kind enough to help me back, but I can manage from here. Jacob emerged from the dining room, dish towel still in hand. His eyebrows rose at the sight of them. Rescue squad reporting for duty, I see. Harrison shot him a warning look. She needs ice and elevation. The sofa in the parlor, Elise interrupted, already moving to lead the way. I'll get ice and the first aid kit. The parlor was bathed in morning light as Harrison helped Audrey to the plush sofa. She immediately arranged herself into what she clearly hoped was a dignified position. Thank you, she said stiffly. I appreciate the assistance, but really, there's no need for all this fuss. Harry seems to have a knack for finding problems to solve, Jacob said with a good-natured smile. Noticed him fixing that loose garden gate just this morning. Harrison felt heat creep up his neck. The latch was loose. Took all of 5 minutes. Elise returned with supplies and knelt to examine Audrey's ankle. Let me see that. I told her it's not broken, Harrison offered. Just a nasty sprain. And when did you get your medical degree, Harry? Jacob's tone was light, teasing. Audrey's eyes met Harrison's briefly, something unspoken passing between them. Recognition of what it meant to have your identity tied to what you did rather than who you were. Well, I'm grateful for the rescue, she said, her voice softer than before. Though I still maintain I could have managed. Of course you could have, Elise agreed, placing the ice pack over the injury. But why should you have to? Keep this elevated. Jacob, pillows? As Jacob disappeared to fetch them, Elise's gaze moved between Harrison and Audrey, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. So you two met on the beach this morning? Literally ran into each other, Harrison said, then at Audrey's sharp look added, well, she ran into the driftwood. I just happened to be passing by. With perfect timing, Elise noted. Our Harry does have a knack for being in the right place. Not your Harry, he corrected automatically. Just passing through, remember? Something flickered in Elise's eyes that Harrison couldn't quite read, but her smile remained warm. I have work to do, Audrey protested. My manuscript. Would you like me to bring your laptop down? Elise offered. You really should keep that ankle elevated for a while. I can get it, Harrison found himself saying. Audrey looked at him in surprise, and he added, if you'd like. Just tell me what you need and where to find it. She studied him for a moment. My laptop. And the blue folder on the desk. I'll show you to Ms. Whitaker's room, Elise said, rising from her knees. To Audrey, she added, if that's all right with you? Audrey nodded, looking slightly flustered. Yes, thank you. That would be helpful. As Harrison followed Elise toward the stairs, he heard Jacob's low chuckle. Resident knight in shining armor. He rolled his eyes. So he liked to help. Was that such a bad thing? It gave him something to do beyond staring at the ocean and wondering what in the world he was supposed to do with the rest of his life. But as he climbed the stairs, he couldn't help remembering the warmth of Audrey against his side and the way her indignation had gradually softened into reluctant acceptance. There was something compelling about her stubborn independence. He recognized it all too well. It was like looking in a mirror. Harrison returned to the parlor with Audrey's laptop and folder to find her already scribbling notes on a legal pad, her injured foot elevated on the pillows Jacob had provided. The morning sun streamed through the windows, catching the silver threads in her chestnut hair. Special delivery, he said, setting the items carefully on the coffee table beside her. She glanced up, a flicker of surprise crossing her features as if she hadn't expected him to actually return. Thank you. You really didn't have to. No trouble. He hesitated, noticing how she winced slightly as she shifted position. How's the ankle? Fine. The word came automatically, her attention already drifting back to her notes. Harrison should have taken the hint. Should have nodded politely and walked away. Instead, he found himself lingering, moving to straighten a stack of magazines on a nearby table. Working on your novel? Audrey's pen paused mid-sentence. Yes. What's it about? She gave him a long look, as if trying to determine whether his interest was genuine. A woman who inherits an old lighthouse, She discovers journals from the former keeper that reveal a century-old mystery. A pause. It's still taking shape. Sounds interesting. He meant it. I always liked lighthouses. The corners of her mouth twitched. Not quite a smile but close. They're good metaphors. Solitary, steadfast. Warning others of danger. Something in her tone made him wonder if she saw herself that way too. Before he could respond, she shifted again, and this time couldn't hide her grimace of pain. That ankle's getting worse, he observed, noticing the swelling had increased despite the ice. You should have it checked out. It's just a sprain. Maybe. Maybe not. Harrison studied her, recognizing the stubborn set of her jaw. There's a clinic in town. I could drive you. 20 minutes, tops. I have work to do. Your novel will still be there after you've taken care of yourself. She glanced up sharply. You sound like Elise. She's a smart woman. Audrey sighed, setting her pen down. I appreciate your concern, but I'm perfectly capable of managing a minor injury. Never said you weren't capable. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. Just offering a ride. She studied him for a long moment. Why? The question caught him off guard. Why what? Why are you so determined to help? You don't know me. Harrison considered this. Force of habit, I guess, he said finally. I spent 30 years making sure people were okay. Hard to turn that off. Something in her expression softened. Your firefighter instincts. Something like that. Silence stretched between them, oddly comfortable. Then Audrey set her laptop aside and began to push herself up. Fine. I suppose it wouldn't hurt to, her sentence cut off with a sharp intake of breath as her injured foot touched the floor. She swayed dangerously. Harrison was beside her in an instant, his arm around her waist, steadying her. Easy there. Her hand gripped his forearm, fingers surprisingly strong. For a moment, they stood frozen, her warmth against his side, the scent of her shampoo, something herbal and clean, filling his senses. Maybe, she said carefully, a professional opinion would be wise. Harrison bit back a smile at her grudging concession. I'll get the truck. 20 minutes later, they sat in the waiting room of Palmar Island Medical Clinic, a small but tidy facility just off Main Street. Audrey perched on the edge of her chair, hands folded in her lap, the picture of contained dignity despite having been carried to and from his truck. Thanks for the ride, she said, breaking the silence. I'm sure you had other plans for your morning. Nothing that can't wait. The truth was, he'd had no plans at all. Just another day of aimless wandering, trying to figure out what came next. Still. I appreciate it. The nurse called Audrey's name before he could respond. Without thinking, Harrison rose to help her, but Audrey held up a hand. I can manage the 10 feet to the exam room, she said, though there was more humor than bite in her tone. Perhaps you could wait? For the ride back? I'll be right here. He watched her hobble carefully after the nurse, refusing the offered wheelchair with a polite but firm shake of her head. Stubborn woman. He couldn't help but admire her determination, even as he shook his head at the unnecessary struggle. The dated magazines in the waiting room held little appeal, so Harrison found himself contemplating the ceiling tiles, the worn carpet, the bulletin board covered with community flyers. Anywhere but his own thoughts, which kept circling back to the same unanswerable questions. What did he have to offer anymore? What was the point of experience and skills that no one needed? 30 minutes later, Audrey emerged, a prescription in one hand and her pride visibly intact. Just a sprain, she announced. Nothing broken. Good news. He stood, offering his arm. What's the treatment plan? Rest, ice, elevation. The usual. She hesitated before taking his arm. And an ace bandage, which the nurse assures me is the height of fashion this season. Harrison smiled at the unexpected touch of humor. Did she recommend crutches? She did. Audrey gestured to a pair of adjustable aluminum crutches sitting by the checkout counter. Insisted, actually. Said I need to stay off it for at least a couple of days. Smart woman, that nurse. Audrey shot him a look that was half irritation, half something warmer. I suppose I should thank you for insisting I get it checked. Just doing my job. At her raised eyebrow, he added, well, my former job. Old habits. The drive back to the inn passed in comfortable silence. Harrison found himself stealing glances at her profile. The slight furrow between her brows, the graceful line of her neck, the way she absently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. There was something compelling about her quiet dignity, her insistence on managing alone. Maybe because he recognized the same impulse in himself. As they pulled up to the Pelican Inn, Harrison turned off the engine but made no move to get out. You know, he said carefully, there's nothing wrong with accepting help when you need it. Audrey's gaze remained fixed on the inn's white clapboard exterior. Says the professional helper. There was a hint of a smile in her voice. I'm not used to needing assistance. Sometimes we all do. The words came out softer than he'd intended. She turned to him then, her green eyes direct. Thank you for the ride, Harrison. And for everything else. You're welcome, Audrey. As he helped her navigate the inn's porch steps, crutches awkwardly balanced under her arms, he realized with a start that for the first time in months, he'd gone hours without that hollow feeling in his chest. Without wondering what the hell he was supposed to do with himself now. Maybe there was something to be said for having a problem to solve. Even if that problem was a stubborn librarian with an injured ankle and a story to tell. Chapter 3. Audrey stared at the mess of dropped papers surrounding her desk chair, frustration tightening her chest. 2 days of hobbling around on crutches had left her with sore underarms, a bruised ego, and the vague suspicion that inanimate objects were conspiring against her. The desk drawer that refused to open fully. The book that had somehow migrated just beyond her reach. And now her carefully organized research notes scattered across the floor like autumn leaves. Absolutely perfect, she muttered, leaning her crutches against the wall to attempt a retrieval. Awkwardly lowering herself, she managed to snag one page before losing her balance and nearly tumbling sideways. She caught herself on the edge of the desk, wincing as her ankle protested the sudden movement. Independence had never been this difficult before. Growing up as the dutiful daughter, then spending decades caring for her increasingly demanding mother, Audrey had prided herself on her self-sufficiency. Yet here she was, defeated by a handful of papers and a drawer that stuck. A knock on her door interrupted her frustrated thoughts. Yes, she called, hastily pulling herself upright, determined not to be caught in such an undignified position. The door opened to reveal Harrison, a fresh ice pack in one hand and a small paper bag in the other. Thought you might need a refresh, he said, lifting the ice pack. His gaze moved from her flushed face to the scattered papers. Bad timing? I dropped a few things, she said stiffly. Nothing important. Harrison set the ice pack on the dresser and the bag beside it. Need a hand? He asked, already crouching to gather the fallen pages. That's really not, Audrey began, but he was already collecting them, arranging them into a neat stack with efficient movements. The ease with which he solved her immediate problem was simultaneously irritating and touching. Character notes? He asked, glancing briefly at the page on top. Audrey felt heat rise to her cheeks. Yes. For my lighthouse keeper. Harrison handed her the stack with a small smile that softened the rugged lines of his face. Sounds like an interesting guy. Haunted by the past, if I caught that right. Something like that. She took the papers, oddly self-conscious. Her protagonist was indeed haunted by regret. By choices unmade, and by the life he might have lived. Though she'd die before admitting it had become something of a self-portrait. Brought you some of Miss Doris's peanut butter cookies, Harrison said, nodding toward the paper bag. She insisted they have medicinal properties. That's very kind, Audrey said, suddenly aware of how close he was standing, how the morning sunlight caught the silver at his temples. Thank you. Ice pack and cookies. All part of the rescue service. His tone was light, but something in his eyes made her breath catch. I don't need rescuing, she said automatically. Course not. He moved toward the door. But everybody needs cookies. Even self-sufficient authors with sprained ankles. As the door closed behind him, Audrey found herself staring at the spot where he'd stood, the papers clutched against her chest, her heart beating a rhythm that had nothing to do with her recent exertion and everything to do with the warmth that had spread through her at his matter-of-fact kindness. The most irritating part wasn't that she needed help. It was how much she'd started looking forward to him offering it. By late afternoon, Audrey had managed to make her way downstairs, a messenger bag slung across her body containing her laptop and notes. She navigated the stairs carefully on her crutches, pausing at each step to ensure her balance. The parlor offered more breathing room than her suite, and she'd begun to feel like a prisoner in her own room. The change of scenery, she told herself, was purely practical. It had nothing to do with being in a place where certain helpful former firefighters might pass by. She settled into the window seat, arranging her injured ankle on a cushion and extracting her materials from the bag. The warm afternoon light spilled across the polished wood floors, and a gentle breeze stirred the curtains. It was the perfect setting for writing, yet the cursor on her screen blinked accusingly, her protagonist's dilemma suddenly as intractable as her own. Ah, there you are. Audrey looked up to find an elderly woman with silver hair arranged in a neat bob watching her from the parlor doorway. Though they hadn't been formally introduced, Audrey had seen her around the inn, usually carrying food or offering unsolicited advice to Elise and Jacob. Miss Doris, isn't it? Audrey said, closing her laptop. The very same. The older woman moved into the room with surprising grace, settling into the armchair opposite. How's that ankle treating you? It's fine, thank you. Her standard response, though the throbbing told her otherwise. Miss Doris's shrewd eyes seemed to see right through the polite fiction. And I suppose our Harry's been mother-henning you half to death. He's been attentive, Audrey admitted, unsure why the observation made her cheeks warm. That man, Miss Doris said with a shake of her head, though her tone was fond. Always needs to be fixing something. Been that way since he checked in 2 weeks ago, wandering around like someone who's lost his purpose. She leaned forward, as if sharing a confidence. Not that I blame him. 30 years of running toward danger, then suddenly told his heart can't take it anymore? Bound to leave a hole. Audrey blinked, processing this unexpected information. His heart? Minor issue, he says. Enough to push him into early retirement. Miss Doris waved a hand dismissively. But you can imagine what that does to a man who's built his whole life around being the hero. Something shifted in Audrey's perspective, puzzle pieces rearranging themselves. The way Harrison seemed to materialize whenever someone needed help. His restlessness. The shadow that sometimes crossed his face when he thought no one was looking. He seems to be handling it well, she offered. Miss Doris's laugh was gentle but knowing. Does he now? Is that why he's been hanging around this place more than necessary, finding loose hinges to fix and guests to rescue? Her gaze was suddenly direct. He was supposed to leave 3 days ago. Extended his stay right after he carried you back from the beach. Audrey's pulse quickened, though she told herself it was simply surprise. I'm sure that's a coincidence. I'm sure it is, Miss Doris agreed, in a tone that suggested exactly the opposite. She stood, smoothing her skirt. Well, I should get back to my baking. Did those cookies find their way to you? Yes, thank you. They were delicious. His idea, Miss Doris said, moving toward the door. He said you seemed like you could use something sweet. She paused, glancing back. Interesting, isn't it? 2 people at crossroads, both a little lost, both a little stubborn. Makes you wonder. Before Audrey could respond, Miss Doris was gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of vanilla and the unsettling awareness that perhaps she and Harrison had more in common than she'd realized. Both at turning points. Both unsure of what came next. Both, perhaps, a little afraid of needing someone else. She turned back to her laptop, the cursor still blinking steadily. But now, instead of her lighthouse keeper's dilemma, all she could think about was a silver-haired firefighter with a heart condition and a knack for showing up exactly when she needed him. Purely coincidence, of course. Nothing more. Chapter 4. Harrison leaned against the porch railing, coffee mug warming his hands in the early morning chill. For days past his planned departure date, and somehow he was still here, still finding reasons to linger at the Pelican Inn. Nice view, isn't it? He turned to find Jacob approaching with his own steaming mug, his knowing smile suggesting he wasn't just talking about the garden. Peaceful, Harrison agreed noncommittally. Jacob leaned against the railing beside him. So. You extended your stay again, I hear. Just a few more days. Harrison kept his tone casual. Thinking about heading down to Charleston after. Jacob took a sip of his coffee. Nothing to do with our injured librarian up in the Magnolia Suite, I'm sure. Heat crept up Harrison's neck. I'm being neighborly. Is that what they're calling it these days? Jacob's grin widened. Funny how many things around here need fixing since she sprained her ankle. The door to her room was sticking, Harrison said, hearing the defensive note in his voice. And that window latch was loose. And the bookshelf that needed leveling? The curtain rod that suddenly required tightening? Harrison stared into his coffee. Keeping busy. Well, you've certainly been that. Jacob's tone softened. She's good people, Harry. Reminds me a bit of Elise when she first arrived here. All plans and structure, trying to keep the world at arm's length. Before Harrison could respond, Elise herself appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, amusement dancing in her eyes. Are you two gossiping out here like a couple of old hens? Just discussing our resident handyman's project list, Jacob replied, shooting Harrison a conspiratorial grin. Well, if you're looking for more work, Elise said, her eyes twinkling, I'm sure Ms. Whitaker could use some help with her research. Something about lighthouse history? Harrison's heart gave a traitorous little leap. Is that so? Though it seems to me we might need a handyman for more than just repairs around here. She exchanged a knowing look with Jacob. Sometimes what really needs fixing isn't quite so obvious. Harrison felt suddenly transparent, as if they could see right through him to the growing attachment he'd been trying to deny. To the way he found himself looking for Audrey each morning, inventing reasons to check on her, simply to hear her voice, to see the flash of humor behind her initial reserve. I'm not, he began, then stopped, unsure how to finish that sentence honestly. Not what? Jacob prompted, his voice gentle now. Not staying? Not interested? Not ready? Harrison sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know. Elise patted his arm. Well, when you figure it out, she takes her coffee with a splash of cream. No sugar. With that, she headed back inside, Jacob following after one last knowing smile in Harrison's direction. The morning had settled into a comfortable rhythm, the kind that made Harrison both restless and content. He sat on the porch, watching a pair of cardinals dart between the oak trees that lined the drive. His coffee had gone lukewarm, but he made no move to refresh it. Mind if I join you? Harrison looked up to find Miss Doris standing at the porch steps, a tray balanced in her hands containing a coffee carafe and what looked suspiciously like her famous blueberry muffins. Be my guest, he said, rising to help her with the tray. I can manage, she insisted, but allowed him to take it anyway. Always have to be the helper, don't you? Harrison set the tray on the small table between the rocking chairs. Force of habit. Miss Doris settled into one of the chairs, the wicker creaking softly beneath her. She poured fresh coffee into his mug without asking if he wanted any. Habits can be comforting. They can also be traps. Harrison took the seat beside her, accepting the refreshed cup with a nod of thanks. Speaking from experience? 6 decades of baking taught me a thing or two. She passed him a muffin on a napkin. About bread, and about people. The muffin was still warm, the berries bursting with sweetness when he took a bite. For a moment, they sat in companionable silence, the only sounds the gentle creak of their rocking chairs and distant waves. "So," Miss Doris said finally, "how much longer are you planning to stay on our little island?" Harrison hesitated. "Not sure. I was supposed to leave days ago. And yet here you are." "Here I am," he agreed. Miss Doris rocked slowly, her knowing eyes fixed on the garden. "Wouldn't have anything to do with our Miss Whitaker, would it?" He nearly choked on his coffee. "I'm just being neighborly." "Of course you are," Miss Doris agreed, in a tone that suggested she believed nothing of the sort. "Very neighborly to fix her window latch, straighten her bookshelf, deliver ice packs twice daily." She smiled at his surprise. "Small inn. Word gets around." Harrison focused on his coffee, unwilling to meet her gaze. "She needed help." "Did she ask for it?" The question caught him off guard. "Well, no, but that's your problem right there." Miss Doris's voice was gentle but firm. "You firefighter types always rushing to the rescue. Sometimes what a person needs isn't rescuing. It's someone who sees them clearly enough to know when to step in and when to step back." Harrison frowned. "Is there a point hiding in all this wisdom, Misty?" Her laugh was warm and genuine. "The point, dear boy, is that some things, and some people, don't need rescuing. They just need someone to stay." She patted his hand. "There's a difference between fixing a problem and being present for the person who has it." The words settled over him like the morning sunlight, warm and revealing. Had he been treating Audrey like another problem to solve? Another emergency to manage? "I don't know how to do that," he admitted quietly. "Be present without fixing. It's who I've always been." "It's what you've always done," Miss Doris corrected. "Not the same thing." Harrison sipped his coffee, letting the distinction sink in. What was left of him when the uniform was gone? When there were no more fires to fight, no more emergencies to manage? "How long do you plan to wander, Harrison?" Miss Doris asked softly. "Charleston next, you said? Then where? Savannah? Jacksonville? Always moving, never putting down roots?" "I had roots once," he said, thinking of his ex-wife, his distant daughter. "Didn't take. Perhaps you were planting in the wrong soil." She nodded toward the inn. "Some plants can't grow until they find exactly the right conditions. Right amount of sun. Right amount of shade." She smiled. "Right amount of stubborn independence with just a touch of vulnerability." Harrison laughed despite himself. "You're not exactly subtle, Miss Doris." "At my age, dear, I don't have time for subtle." She peered at him over her coffee cup. "You'll be leaving soon, I expect. Moving on to your next temporary stop?" The question landed like a weight on his chest. He hadn't really thought about it, had been deliberately not thinking about it. But she was right. His extended stay couldn't last forever. Sooner or later, he'd have to move on, continue his aimless journey toward what? What was he looking for? "I haven't decided," he said finally. "Well, don't take too long." Miss Doris rose, gathering the empty mugs onto her tray. "Some opportunities only come once. Like that sunset cruise the island runs every Friday evening. Lovely way to see the lighthouse. Very romantic." She winked. "Probably sold out by now, though." Before Harrison could respond to this transparent suggestion, the screen door opened. He turned to see Audrey balancing on her crutches, her auburn hair loose around her shoulders instead of in its usual neat twist. The morning light caught the silver strands threading through it, turning them to quicksilver. "Oh," she said, pausing at the sight of them. "I didn't mean to interrupt." "Not at all, dear," Miss Doris said brightly. "Harrison and I were just finishing our coffee. In fact, I was about to head inside." She picked up her tray with a speed that belied her years. "You two enjoy this beautiful morning." And with that, she was gone, leaving an amused Harrison and a slightly bewildered Audrey in her wake. "Hurricane Doris," Harrison said with a smile. "Force of nature." so I've noticed. Audrey managed to maneuver herself to the chair Miss Doris had vacated, lowering herself with careful dignity. She cornered me yesterday in the parlor. Very informative conversation. Something about the way she said it made Harrison wonder exactly what information Miss Doris had shared. She means well. I'm sure she does. Audrey adjusted her injured ankle on the footstool, wincing slightly. Though her matchmaking is about as subtle as a foghorn. Harrison chuckled, relieved by her directness. Tell me about it. Silence settled between them. The kind that didn't need filling. Harrison found himself studying her profile, the graceful line of her neck, the way her fingertips absently traced patterns on the arm of her chair. There was an elegant solidity to her, a presence that made him acutely aware of his own. I wanted to thank you, she said finally, her gaze fixed on the garden. For all your help these past few days. The bookshelf, the window latch, all of it. Not a problem. He hesitated, then added, I hope I haven't been imposing. Miss Doris pointed out I might have a bit of a hero complex. Audrey's lips curved into a small smile. Just a bit. If it's been too much. It hasn't. Her eyes met his, startlingly direct. It's been nice having someone around who notices what needs doing without being asked. A faint blush colored her cheeks. Though I'm not used to it. No? She shook her head. I've always been the one doing the noticing. Taking care of things. Of people. Her gaze drifted back to the garden. It's strange being on the other side. Harrison understood perfectly. The discomfort of needing, of accepting, when you've built your life around being the giver, the fixer. Like trying to write with your non-dominant hand, he offered. Her eyes widened slightly, surprise and recognition flickering across her features. Exactly like that. Awkward. Unfamiliar. She tilted her head, studying him with new interest. You understand. It wasn't a question, but he answered anyway. More than I'd like to admit. Another silence, this one charged with something new. Recognition. Connection. Would you like some coffee? He asked. I could grab you a cup. For a moment, he thought she might accept. Then she shook her head, but there was warmth in her eyes that hadn't been there before. I should get back to my writing. But thank you. As she gathered her crutches and prepared to stand, Harrison resisted the urge to immediately help her. Instead, he waited, watching as she found her balance with careful determination. Only when she was steady did he rise, holding the door for her. Harrison, she said, pausing in the doorway. Yes? I hear there's a sunset cruise tomorrow evening. Around the lighthouse. She didn't quite meet his eyes. I was thinking of going. For research. His heart gave a sudden, hopeful leap. Research, huh? For my book. Now she did look at him, a challenge in her green eyes. Would you like to join me? Harrison couldn't help the smile that spread across his face. I'd be honored. Good. She nodded once, as if confirming a business arrangement, but he caught the hint of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. 7 o'clock at the marina, then. I'll be there. Chapter 5. Audrey stood at the edge of the marina dock, acutely aware of the gap between the wooden planks and the gently bobbing tour boat. One small step for most people, but something of a challenge when balanced on crutches with an injured ankle. Behind her, Harrison waited patiently, making no move to assist unless she asked. She appreciated that more than she could express. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the water, turning it to liquid gold. A perfect evening for a lighthouse tour. For research, of course. She'd repeated that to herself at least a dozen times while getting ready, as if the mantra might quell the flutter of anticipation she'd felt since Harrison had accepted her invitation. You sure you don't want a hand? He asked, his voice close enough that she could feel his warmth at her back. I'm sure, she replied, adjusting her grip on her crutches. Just stay close? Always. The simple word resonated through her, stirring something she'd thought long dormant. She forced her attention back to the task at hand, gauging the distance and shift of the boat against the dock. Taking a deep breath, she maneuvered herself forward, letting one crutch cross first, then placing her good foot securely on the boat deck before bringing the injured one across. "Welcome aboard the Island, lady," greeted the captain, a weathered man with salt and pepper beard who nodded approvingly at her successful boarding. "Nice work. We've got a smooth evening ahead, so your ankle should do just fine." He gestured toward the passenger seating. "Best views are port side for the lighthouse approach." Harrison stepped easily onto the boat behind her. "Port is left," he whispered, close enough that his breath stirred the hair near her ear. "I know what port is," she replied, though without the sharp edge such a correction might have held a few days ago. His soft chuckle warmed her as they made their way to the padded bench seats running along the boat's left side. Settling herself took some work, but soon she was seated comfortably, crutches stowed beneath the bench, ankle propped on a cushion Harrison had somehow procured without her noticing. "Better?" he asked, taking the seat beside her, not quite touching but close enough that she was aware of the space between them. "Perfect," she admitted. And it was, between the gentle rocking of the boat, the salt-tinged breeze, and the golden light of approaching sunset. She pulled her small notebook from her bag, determined to remember her purpose here. "I've never actually seen the lighthouse up close. Hard to write about one when your entire experience comes from Google searches and library books." "Nothing beats first-hand research," Harrison agreed, stretching his long legs out before him. He looked different today. More relaxed, his usual alertness softened by something she couldn't quite name. He'd exchanged his typical Henley for a button-down shirt in a deep blue that matched his eyes, the sleeves rolled up to reveal tanned forearms. The boat's engine hummed to life, vibrating gently beneath them as they pulled away from the dock. A handful of other passengers, mostly couples, Audrey noted with a flush, found seats around the small vessel. A young woman began a practiced spiel about the island's history, but Audrey found her attention drifting to the shoreline, to the Pelican Inn visible on its gentle rise above the beach. "Strange seeing it from the water," Harrison commented, following her gaze. "It looks smaller somehow. More vulnerable." The observation surprised her. "Changes your perspective," he agreed. "Seeing things from a distance sometimes makes them clearer." She glanced at him, wondering if they were still talking about the inn. "What have you been seeing more clearly lately?" His eyes met hers, something unguarded in their depths. "That I've been running from one temporary place to another since my retirement. That maybe it's time to stop running." The honesty caught her off guard. "Why did you come to Palmar Island?" she asked, the question she'd been wondering since their first encounter. "No real reason. Saw a brochure at a rest stop in Georgia. Liked the lighthouse on the cover." He shrugged. "As good a place as any to figure out what comes next." "And have you figured it out?" The boat rounded a bend in the shoreline, bringing the lighthouse into view for the first time. It stood tall and proud, its white and red stripes gleaming in the golden hour light. Harrison's gaze lingered on it before returning to her. "Getting closer," he said, and she wasn't entirely sure which question he was answering. The tour guide had moved on to explaining the lighthouse's history, built in 1868, automated in 1956, nearly destroyed in Hurricane Hugo before being painstakingly restored. Audrey dutifully jotted notes, though her attention kept drifting to the man beside her. "What about you?" Harrison asked as the guide moved to the other side of the boat. "Why a lighthouse for your novel? Why not I don't know, a plantation house?" Audrey smiled, tracing her pen along the edge of her notebook. "Lighthouses are solitary but purposeful. Their entire existence is dedicated to helping others find their way safely home." She hesitated, then admitted, "I always wanted to be that for someone. A guiding light. But I spent so many years just trying to keep my mother's ship from sinking that I never got the chance." The words had emerged without her permission, more honest than she'd intended. She felt suddenly exposed, vulnerable in a way that made her want to retreat behind her usual reserve. Harrison didn't rush to fill the silence that followed, didn't offer platitudes or easy comfort. Instead, he simply nodded, his expression thoughtful. It's never too late to light the lamp, he said finally. Even lighthouses have to be built before they can guide anyone home. Something about the simplicity of his response, the absence of pity, loosened a knot inside her chest. Is that what you're doing now? Building your lighthouse? Trying to figure out what it might look like, he admitted. What about you? Is that what this novel represents? The boat glided smoothly through the water, bringing them ever closer to the lighthouse that now dominated the horizon. Audrey considered his question, turning it over like a shell found on the beach, examining its contours. Maybe, she said. Or maybe I'm just trying to find my own way home first. The sun dipped lower, casting long fingers of gold across the water. Without thinking, Audrey shifted to capture the view in her notebook, a quick sketch of light and shadow. Her shoulder brushed against Harrison's, a brief touch that sent a current of awareness through her. She didn't pull away. You know, Harrison said, his voice a low rumble beside her, I don't think I've been this relaxed in years. She glanced up at him, struck by the openness in his expression. It's the ocean air, she offered, though she suspected it was something else entirely. Must be, he agreed, his smile suggesting he didn't believe it either. As the boat curved around toward the lighthouse, Audrey found herself studying Harrison's profile. The strong line of his jaw, the laugh lines around his eyes, the silver at his temples. There was a steadiness to him that drew her, like a ship to safe harbor. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, she found herself leaning slightly into the space between them, toward whatever was building in this moment, on this boat, beneath this golden sky. The boat slowed as they approached the lighthouse. The sunset had transformed the sky into a canvas of amber and rose, the colors reflecting on the water's surface in shimmering patterns. The original lens was a first-order Fresnel, Harrison explained, his voice taking on a quiet authority that surprised her. Much bigger than what they used in later years. It could project light for almost 20 miles. How do you know all this? Audrey asked, genuinely curious. He smiled, a hint of self-consciousness in the gesture. I might have done some reading before tonight. Thought it might help with your research. The admission touched her more than she expected. Thank you, she said softly. Did you know most lighthouses have their own unique light pattern? Harrison continued. It helps sailors identify which lighthouse they're seeing. Like a fingerprint. A signature, Audrey murmured, thinking of her lighthouse keeper character. Something distinctly their own. The boat rocked gently as it circled closer to the stone foundation rising from the water. The tour guide had moved to the bow, but Audrey found herself more interested in Harrison's explanations, delivered without pretension, just a genuine desire to share what might be useful to her work. The wind picked up as they rounded the eastern side of the lighthouse, sending the loose strands of her hair dancing across her face. She reached to brush them away, but Harrison's hand was there first, his fingers gentle as they swept the wayward lock behind her ear. There, he said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. Now you can see. His hand lingered near her cheek, a breath away from touching her again. Audrey found herself unable to look away from his eyes, from the warmth and something deeper she saw reflected there. The space between them seemed charged with possibility, with unspoken questions. For one breathless moment, the world narrowed to just this. His closeness, the lighthouse, her heart beating a rhythm she'd forgotten it knew. And then panic surged through her, sudden and fierce. Too much, too fast. Too real. I should take some notes, she said abruptly, pulling back and fumbling for her notebook. For the book. That's why we're here, after all. Research. She could feel Harrison's gaze on her face, could sense his confusion at her sudden retreat. But he didn't press, didn't try to recapture the moment she'd broken. Of course, he said, his voice carefully neutral. What else would you like to know about the lighthouse? Audrey stared down at her notebook, at the blank page that seemed to mock her cowardice. What was she so afraid of? That she might actually feel something? That he might? That he would leave, like everyone eventually did? The foundation, she said, forcing steadiness into her voice. How deep does it go? As Harrison began explaining the engineering behind lighthouse construction, Audrey tried to focus on his words rather than the lingering sensation of his fingers near her skin. She told herself she'd imagined the connection, the charge between them. That it was simply the romantic setting, the golden light, the proximity of bodies on a small boat. Nothing more. But as the boat completed its circuit and turned back toward the marina, Audrey couldn't help glancing at Harrison's profile, at the way the fading light traced the contours of his face. And she couldn't quite convince herself that what she'd felt wasn't real. Only that it was safer to pretend it wasn't. Chapter 6. The smell of wood smoke mingled with salt air as Harrison added another log to the crackling fire. The flames leapt higher, casting dancing shadows across the small gathering of people seated in a rough circle on blankets and beach chairs. The casual beach bonfire had been Elisa's idea. "Just a little get-together for our guests," she'd said, though the knowing glint in her eye suggested ulterior motives. Harrison glanced toward the path leading from the inn, trying not to be obvious about checking for Audrey's arrival. She'd been noticeably absent at breakfast that morning, and when he'd run into her briefly in the parlor, her smile had been polite but distant, her excuses about needing to work on her manuscript a transparent retreat from the moment they'd shared on the boat. "She'll come," Jacob said quietly, appearing at Harrison's side with 2 bottles of beer. He handed one to Harrison. "Elise can be very persuasive." "Who says I'm waiting for anyone?" Harrison replied, accepting the bottle with a nod of thanks. Jacob's knowing smile was answer enough. "You've got it bad, my friend." Harrison took a long pull from his beer, neither confirming nor denying the observation. What could he say? That he couldn't stop thinking about the way Audrey's eyes had reflected the moonbeam on their return from the lighthouse? That he'd lain awake half the night replaying that moment when she'd pulled away, wondering what he'd done wrong? "Not sure what it is," he said finally. "Or if it even matters. I'm leaving soon anyway." "Are you?" Jacob's question was gentle but direct. "Because it seems to me you keep finding reasons to stay." Before Harrison could formulate a response, a murmur of greetings drew his attention back to the path. Audrey stood at the edge of the firelight, her crutches abandoned in favor of a simple walking cane. She wore a light sweater over loose linen pants, her hair pulled back in a soft knot at the nape of her neck. Simple, practical. Yet something about the way the firelight caught the curves of her face made his breath catch. Elise immediately went to greet her, guiding her to an empty chair that was conveniently located directly across the fire from Harrison. He resisted the urge to immediately go to her, to help her settle, to make sure she was comfortable. Instead, he raised his bottle in a silent greeting when her eyes found his. She nodded in acknowledgement, but quickly turned her attention to Miss Doris, who was offering her a plate of something that looked delicious. The distance between them felt wider than the circle of sand and fire that separated them physically. "Give her time," Jacob murmured, clapping him on the shoulder before moving away to help Elise distribute drinks. The evening progressed with the easy rhythm of casual gathering. Conversations ebbed and flowed. Laughter punctuated the sound of waves. But Harrison remained acutely aware of Audrey across the flames, of how she participated in the group's discussion but avoided direct engagement with him. Her walls were up, higher than before. "Marshmallows," Elise announced, producing a bag and several long roasting sticks. "No bonfire is complete without them." As the treats were passed around, Harrison found himself caught in an unwelcome memory of his ex-wife and his daughter at a similar beach fire years ago. Before everything had fallen apart. Before the job had consumed him. And before the missed birthdays and cancelled anniversaries had built a wall between them that even he, with all his rescue training, couldn't breach. "Penny for your thoughts," Miss Doris said, settling into the chair beside him with a grace that belied her years. "You look like a man solving the problems of the universe." "Just remembering," he replied. "Ah." She nodded as if he'd said much more. "The past has its place, but it makes a terrible compass, dear. You can't navigate forward while staring back." Harrison smiled despite himself. "You never run out of metaphors, do you? Life provides an endless supply." Her shrewd eyes moved to Audrey, then back to him. She's scared, you know. Not of you. Of what you represent. And what's that? The possibility of a future different from the one she's planned. Miss Doris patted his arm before rising. Much like someone else I know. As she moved away, Harrison's gaze drifted back to Audrey. The firelight softened her features, made her look younger, more vulnerable. As if sensing his attention, she glanced up, meeting his eyes across the flames. For a brief moment, the wariness in her expression gave way to something softer, more uncertain. Then Jacob began strumming a guitar, breaking the moment as conversation shifted to requests for songs. Harrison found himself drawn into the music despite his preoccupation, joining in on a chorus he hadn't realized he remembered. Across the fire, Audrey remained quiet, watching, but there was a wistfulness in her expression that hadn't been there before. When the song ended, she rose carefully, using her cane for support. "I think I'll head back," she announced to no one in particular. "My ankles had enough excitement for one evening." "I'll walk you," Elise offered immediately. "No need," Audrey said with a smile. "I'm getting quite proficient with this." She waggled her cane. "Besides, I wouldn't want to pull you away from your hosting duties." Before Harrison could offer, Jacob caught his eye and gave a subtle shake of his head. The message was clear: let her go. Let her come to you. It went against every instinct Harrison possessed to watch her make her way back toward the inn alone, her solitary figure silhouetted against the moonlit path. But he remained where he was, nursing his beer, joining half-heartedly in another song. Watched her pause and turn around. "Harrison," she called, her voice carrying just enough to reach him over the music. "Could I ask you something? About firefighting?" The conversation around the fire continued, but Harrison set his beer down immediately. "Of course," he said, rising from his seat. Jacob gave him an encouraging nod as he made his way around the circle toward Audrey. The sand shifted beneath his feet as he approached her, standing at the edge of the firelight. "Everything okay?" he asked, stopping beside her. "I've hit a wall with my novel," she admitted, her voice carrying a note of frustration. "My lighthouse keeper was a firefighter in his earlier life, before taking the solitary post. But I've never," she gestured vaguely. "I don't know how to write it authentically. What it feels like to run toward danger while everyone else runs away." "Want to walk while we talk?" he offered, gesturing toward the shoreline where moonlight danced across gentle waves. She nodded, and they fell into step together, Harrison matching his pace to her slower one. The sounds of conversation and music faded behind them as they moved toward the shore, close enough that the waves nearly reached their feet before retreating. "What do you want to know?" he asked. "Everything." She glanced at him, then away. "Or maybe how it felt. Why you did it for so long." They reached a large piece of driftwood, bleached silver by sun and salt, shaped almost like a bench. Audrey lowered herself onto it with careful movements, and Harrison settled beside her, leaving respectful space between them. "I always knew," he said finally. "Even as a kid. While other boys wanted to be astronauts or baseball players, I knew I'd be a firefighter. My uncle was one. I saw how people looked at him, respected him. How he made a difference. Was it what you expected? Once you started?" Harrison leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Yes and no. The physical challenges, the training was what I expected. But the feeling..." He paused, searching for words. "Imagine being absolutely certain of your purpose. Knowing exactly why you're here and what you're meant to do. That's what it felt like on good days." "And on bad days?" Audrey's voice was soft, her attention fully on him now. "On bad days, you question everything. Whether you're good enough, fast enough, strong enough." His voice dropped. "Whether you deserve to come home when someone else didn't." The admission hung between them in the salt-laden air. Harrison couldn't remember the last time he'd spoken so openly about the weight he'd carried, the burden of responsibility that had shaped his entire adult life. "That's why your character needs a lighthouse," he said, turning to face her. "After running toward fires for years, he needs a different kind of purpose." One where he's still helping, still guiding others to safety, but from a distance. Protected. Alone. Audrey's eyes widened slightly. Yes, she whispered. That's exactly it. Something shifted between them, a door opening that had been merely cracked before. They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the waves, the distant music from the bonfire. I took care of my mother for 28 years, Audrey said suddenly. After my father left, it was just us. And then she got sick. Not all at once, but gradually. The kind of illness that steals a person piece by piece. Harrison remained silent, recognizing the rare gift of her confidence. I became a librarian because it was practical. Steady hours, close to home. I told myself it was temporary, just until she got better. But she never did. Her fingers twisted in her lap. By the time she died last year, I'd spent so long being her caretaker that I didn't know who I was without that role. So you came here, Harrison said gently. To find out. To write the book I'd been planning for decades. To do something for myself, finally. She gave a small, self-deprecating laugh. And I tripped over a piece of driftwood not unlike this one. Lucky driftwood, Harrison said, surprising a genuine smile from her. The conversation flowed more easily after that, moving from her novel to his daughter in California, to the lighthouse that had drawn them both to this island. The moon climbed higher, casting silver light across the water, but neither made a move to return to the bonfire or the inn. Why did you really come to the island? Audrey asked eventually, the question hanging in the night air between them. Harrison was quiet for a long moment. My heart, he said finally. A minor episode, they called it. Enough to end my career, not enough to really slow me down. But suddenly everything I'd built my life around was gone. He looked out at the distant lighthouse. I didn't know who I was anymore. And now? Her voice was soft, cautious. Now. He turned to face her, finding her eyes in the moonlight. Now I'm starting to think maybe there's more to me than just what I did for a living. Maybe there's a second act I hadn't planned on. Something vulnerable and hopeful passed between them, a current strong enough that Harrison could almost feel it physically. Without thinking, he reached out, his fingers finding hers on the driftwood between them. To his surprise and relief, she didn't pull away. I should probably get back, she said after a long moment, though she made no move to rise. My ankle. Of course. Harrison stood, offering his hand. Let me walk you. No heroics, no carrying. Just company. Audrey looked at his outstretched hand, then up at his face. Whatever she saw there must have reassured her, because she took his hand and allowed him to help her to her feet. I'd like that, she said simply. They walked slowly back toward the inn, their conversation continuing in comfortable tones. The bonfire was still going strong, but they skirted its edges with small waves to the others, following the shell-lined path that led up to the porch. The night air had cooled enough that the warmth of the inn beckoned invitingly through the windows. Tea? Harrison asked as they stepped into the quiet lobby. I think there's still some hot water in the carafe Elise set out earlier. That sounds perfect, Audrey nodded, looking more relaxed than he'd seen her since the boat ride. The common room was empty, the other guests still enjoying the beach bonfire. A small lamp cast a warm glow over the comfortable seating area, and the embers in the fireplace still glowed with fading heat. Harrison busied himself preparing 2 mugs of tea while Audrey settled onto the small sofa, propping her ankle on a footstool. Thank you for your stories, she said as he handed her a steaming mug and took the seat beside her. They'll help with my character, but... She hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug. It was more than research. I want you to know that. Harrison nodded and felt something warm unfurl in his chest that had nothing to do with the tea. Does your lighthouse keeper get a happy ending? Audrey considered this, her expression thoughtful in the low light. I haven't decided yet. I thought he would remain alone, finding purpose in his solitude. Her eyes met his. Now I'm not so sure. What changed? Maybe I did, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Chapter 7. Audrey's fingers flew across the keyboard, words pouring out with an ease she hadn't experienced in years. The lighthouse keeper's story was taking shape, his character deepening with each scene. No longer a flat silhouette, he'd become a man with wounds that had healed imperfectly, with a carefully constructed solitude that both protected and isolated him. Just like someone else she was trying very hard not to think about. She paused and read back the paragraph she'd just written. Daniel watched the storm from the lighthouse tower, rain lashing against the glass as lightning split the sky. In his 30 years of firefighting, he'd learned that the most dangerous blazes often started with a single strike. Now, as keeper of the light, he still searched the horizon for danger. Only this time, he stood apart from it, warning others rather than rushing in himself. With a groan, Audrey pushed away from her desk. It was happening again. Every time she tried to write her lighthouse keeper, Harrison's voice seemed to whisper in her ear, his stories coloring every scene. She'd spent 3 days working on the novel, sequestered in her room except for meals, and somehow Harrison had followed her onto every page. She paced to the window, her ankle now strong enough to bear weight for short periods. The view overlooked the garden, where morning sun filtered through oak branches. The same path she and Harrison had walked 4 nights ago, his hand steady beneath her elbow, his voice low as he shared stories she suspected few people had heard. "This is ridiculous," she muttered. "You're confusing research with reality." But was she? The memory of his fingers brushing against hers on the driftwood bench felt real enough. The way his eyes had sought hers across the quiet common room, warm with something that looked remarkably like longing. Her phone chimed with a text message. Harrison. "Morning walk today? Ankle up to it?" 3 days ago, her heart would have leapt at the invitation. Now, it sank beneath the weight of her fears. What was she doing? She was almost 50, for heaven's sake. Too old for summer romances, too set in her ways for new beginnings. Too sensible to believe that someone like Harrison could truly be interested in someone like her, once the novelty wore off. Rain check? Deep in writing mode today. Making good progress. Her thumb hovered over the send button longer than it should have. Finally, she pressed it, watching the message bubble away, hating the relief that came with retreat. By afternoon, restlessness drove her from her room. She made her way downstairs, hoping a change of scenery might clear her head. "There you are," Miss Doris's voice startled her as she settled into the parlor window seat. The older woman stood in the doorway, a plate of cookies in hand. "I was beginning to think you'd checked out without saying goodbye." "I've been working," Audrey said, gesturing to her laptop. "The novel's coming along." Miss Doris set the plate down. "And how's our firefighter?" "My lighthouse keeper is developing nicely," Audrey replied, emphasizing the correction. Miss Doris's knowing smile was almost unbearable. "That's not the one I meant, dear. I wouldn't know how Harrison is. I've been busy." "I see." Miss Doris settled into the armchair opposite. "You know, fear is a funny thing. We think it protects us, keeps us safe from hurt. But mostly, it just keeps us from living." "I'm not afraid," Audrey said, the defensive note in her voice betraying the lie. "Of course not. That's why you've been hiding in your room since the bonfire. That's why Harrison's been walking the beach alone every morning, looking like a man who's lost something precious." Before Audrey could respond, the sound of familiar footsteps on the porch made her pulse quicken. Harrison appeared in the doorway, a faint smile crossing his features when he saw her. "There you are," he said. "I was beginning to think you'd disappeared." "Just working," Audrey replied, the words feeling mechanical. Miss Doris excused herself with transparent haste, leaving them alone. Harrison settled into the chair she'd vacated. "How's the novel coming?" "Good," she said, closing her laptop. "Too good, maybe." His brow furrowed. "How can it be too good?" "Sometimes characters take on a life of their own," she said. "They start to feel too real. Too close." Understanding dawned in his eyes. "Your lighthouse keeper." "Yes." She looked down at her hands. I'm afraid I'm getting too attached to a fictional character. The silence held a weight she couldn't bring herself to acknowledge. When she finally looked up, Harrison was watching her with an expression that made her heart ache. It felt like part understanding, part hurt, part something deeper. Sometimes it's easier to love a story than a person, he said quietly. Stories don't leave. They don't change. They don't expect anything back. He rose, his movements careful. I wanted to let you know I'll be checking out tomorrow. Heading down to Charleston after all. The words fell like stones. So soon? No reason to stay, he said simply. Unless there is? It was a question, an opening, a hand extended across the distance she'd created. All she had to do was reach back. Please don't go. I think I might be falling in love with you. I'm scared, but I want to try. But fear was powerful. Safe travels, she said instead, the words like ashes in her mouth. He nodded once. Good luck with your novel. I hope your lighthouse keeper finds what he's looking for. As he walked away, Audrey turned back to the window, watching as he crossed the garden toward the beach path. Inside her, something fragile began to crack. She'd come to Palmar Island to find herself, to write her story. Instead, she'd found Harrison, and now she was letting him walk away. Because it was safer. Because after a lifetime of putting others first, she didn't know how to reach for something she truly wanted. Her gaze fell to her laptop, to the novel that now felt like both confession and cowardice. Her lighthouse keeper, guiding others to safety while remaining apart. Longing for connection but afraid to reach for it. She'd written herself into a corner, both on the page and in reality. Chapter 8. Harrison rapped his knuckles against the doorframe of the Magnolia Suite. He'd been standing there for nearly a full minute, debating whether this confrontation was worth it. It might be easier to just leave, to follow the pattern he'd established since his forced retirement. Arrive, stay a while, move on when things got complicated. But something about Audrey Whitaker made complicated feel worth navigating. Harrison. Her voice held surprise as she opened the door, one hand instinctively moving to smooth her hair. I was. Avoiding me? He kept his tone light, but the question hung between them. Audrey's shoulders stiffened slightly. I've been working. For days at a time? Even at meals, you barely looked at me. He leaned against the doorframe, not entering her space but not backing away either. After the bonfire, I thought, but then you just disappeared. I didn't disappear. I've been right here. She gestured to her room, to the laptop open on the desk, pages of notes scattered beside it. You know what I mean. Her gaze dropped, confirmation enough. I needed some space to think. And have you? Thought about it? About what, exactly? A defensive edge crept into her voice. Harrison ran a hand through his hair, frustration building. About us, Audrey. About whatever's happening between us. There is no us, Harrison. The words came too quickly, too practiced, as if she'd been rehearsing them. We met because I fell. You helped because that's what you do. It was a nice connection, but let's not make it more than it was. The dismissal stung, but something in her expression kept him from simply accepting it. Is that really what you think? That I only helped you because it's some kind of compulsion? Isn't it? She crossed her arms, a barrier between them. You said yourself, it's hard to turn off 30 years of rescuing people. That's not fair, and you know it. He took a step closer, his voice lowering. What happened on the beach that night wasn't about rescuing anyone. Neither was the lighthouse tour. Or have you convinced yourself that was all just research too? Maybe it was, she countered, her chin lifting slightly. Maybe you needed to feel useful again. To find someone who needed saving. The accusation hit home with uncomfortable precision. Harrison felt heat rise in his chest. And maybe you're so afraid of stepping into your new life that you'd rather sabotage anything good before it has a chance to become something you might lose. The color drained from Audrey's face. For a moment, they stood in taut silence, the truth of his words hanging between them. "That's not," she began, then stopped, visibly regrouping. "You don't know me, Harrison." "Not really. A few conversations, a boat ride, and suddenly you think you understand everything about me?" "I understand enough." His voice softened despite his anger. "I understand that you've spent your whole life being what other people needed. That you're terrified of wanting something for yourself. That it's easier to hide behind your novel than to take a risk on something real. And what about you?" Her voice rose slightly, edges sharpening. "Running from place to place, never staying long enough to put down roots? At least I'm trying to build something, even if it's just on paper. I'm here, aren't I?" He gestured between them. "Standing in front of you, asking you to consider the possibility that maybe we could be good for each other. And then what? You stay on Palmar Island forever, because we shared a few nice moments?" She shook her head. "That's not who you are, Harrison." The truth of that statement took some of the fire out of him. "I don't have to go." "But you will." Her voice had lost its edge, resignation replacing anger. "Sooner or later." "And I." She faltered, vulnerability briefly breaking through. "I can't be something else you leave behind." Harrison felt the ground shifting beneath him, his certainty crumbling. He'd thought they were arguing about her fears, her retreat. But her words exposed his own pattern with uncomfortable clarity. "So that's it?" he asked quietly. "We don't even try because it might not work out?" "I think it's better this way." Audrey's voice was steady, but her fingers worried at the sleeve of her cardigan. "Cleaner. Safer, you mean?" He couldn't keep the bitterness from his tone. "Better than risking getting hurt. Please, just go." She took a step back, physically widening the space between them. "This isn't helping either of us." Harrison stood for a long moment, searching her face for any sign that she didn't mean it, that this was just fear talking. But all he saw was resolve, the walls firmly back in place. "Fine," he said finally. "I'll go. But for the record, Audrey? This isn't about me needing to rescue someone. This is about me finding the first person in years who made me want to stay. Who made me feel like maybe I was more than just what I did for a living." He took a step back. "I guess I was wrong." As he turned to leave, part of him, the part that had spent a lifetime rushing back into burning buildings when everyone else was running out, wanted desperately to turn around, to push past her defenses, to prove he wasn't giving up so easily. But for once in his life, Harrison Tate didn't charge back in. He walked away, each step down the corridor feeling like surrender. By morning, he'd be gone. She was right about that much, at least. He just wished she'd been wrong about everything else. Chapter 9. The garden outside the Magnolia Suites window offered little comfort as Audrey stared through the glass. She'd barely slept, the echoes of yesterday's confrontation with Harrison haunting the night hours. His words had burrowed deep, finding the truth she'd been avoiding. "This is about me finding the first person in years who made me want to stay." She pressed her forehead against the cool window pane. The morning light revealed an empty parking space where Harrison's truck had been. He'd gone, like he said he would. Like she'd told him to. Her teacup sat untouched on the side table, the herbal blend gone cold hours ago. She'd attempted to eat the toast Elise had kindly brought up, but each bite had tasted like cardboard. How could something as simple as breakfast suddenly feel so impossible? Her ankle barely hurt anymore, the sprain almost completely healed. Soon she wouldn't even have that reminder of how they'd met. Harrison carrying her across the beach. His unexpected kindness. The beginning of something she'd been too afraid to name. Her laptop sat open on the desk, the cursor blinking on the same paragraph she'd been staring at for hours. Her lighthouse keeper stood at his station, vigilant but alone, his isolation both shield and prison. The metaphor wasn't lost on her. She'd come to Palmar Island to write, to find herself after decades of caregiving. 3 months of solitude and creativity. That had been the plan. Not meeting someone who made her question everything she thought she knew about herself. Not feeling this hollow ache at the thought of never seeing him again. Ridiculous, she muttered, pushing away from the window and limping to the desk. You've known him for what, 2 weeks? Less? This isn't some romance novel. Yet the pain in her chest felt undeniably real. As real as the words Harrison had flung at her yesterday. You're so afraid of stepping into your new life that you'd rather sabotage anything good before it has a chance to become something you might lose. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Not hungry, she called, assuming it was Elise with a second attempt at breakfast. Then it's a good thing I didn't bring food, Miss Doris's voice replied. Audrey sighed, crossing to open the door. The older woman stood in the hallway, arms crossed, silver eyebrows raised in an expression that brooked no argument. May I come in? She asked, already stepping inside. My, it's stuffy in here. When was the last time you opened a window? She moved to the window and unlatched it, letting in a fresh breeze that carried the scent of jasmine and sea salt. I'm not in the mood for company, Audrey said, returning to her desk chair. I'm not company. I'm an intervention. Miss Doris settled onto the armchair by the window, smoothing her floral skirt with practiced hands. He left, you know. Checked out at dawn. Jacob said he barely said goodbye, just handed over his key and drove away with the sunrise. I know. Audrey's fingers found a loose thread on her sleeve, worrying it. It's better this way. Is it? Miss Doris's tone was gentle but probing. You've been glowing since you met that man. Now you look like someone dimmed all the lights. It was a brief connection. Nothing more. The words sounded hollow even to her own ears. My dear girl. Miss Doris leaned forward, her pale blue eyes surprisingly fierce. That man didn't help you because of some hero complex or duty. He helped you because from the moment he carried you off that beach, he was falling in love with you. The words hit Audrey like a physical blow. He couldn't have been. We barely know each other. Sometimes knowing comes quicker than we expect. Sometimes it takes one look, one conversation, one moment when everything suddenly makes sense. Miss Doris's voice softened. And sometimes it takes a lifetime of looking before we recognize what's right in front of us. Even if that were true, Audrey began, her throat tightening, he was leaving anyway. That's what he does. Was he? Or was he waiting for a reason to stay? Miss Doris stood, moving to Audrey's desk where the manuscript pages lay scattered. You know, I read once that we write what we need to learn. That stories are how we work through the truths we're not quite ready to face. Audrey's gaze fell to her novel, to the lighthouse keeper searching the horizon for ships that might never come. Guiding others to safety while remaining apart. Just as she'd accused Harrison of doing. As she'd been doing herself. She remembered the night on the beach after the bonfire, the way Harrison had spoken about his career ending, about losing his sense of purpose. She'd recognized herself in his words. The struggle to redefine yourself when everything that had shaped your identity was suddenly gone. And then there was the boat tour, the moment when he'd brushed that strand of hair from her face, his touch so gentle it had nearly brought tears to her eyes. She'd pulled away not because she didn't want his touch, but because she wanted it too much. I'm afraid, she whispered, the admission finally breaking free. I've spent my whole adult life being needed by someone who could never truly see me. What if I'm confusing kindness for something deeper? What if I'm clinging to the first person who's paid attention to me in years? Is that what you truly believe? Miss Doris asked. That his feelings, and yours, are that shallow? Audrey remembered the look in Harrison's eyes when he'd confronted her yesterday. The hurt, yes, but also the certainty. The rawness of his admission. No, she admitted. But I'm still afraid. Of course you are. Miss Doris's hand came to rest on her shoulder. Love is terrifying at any age. Especially when we've spent years building walls to protect ourselves. What if it doesn't work? What if he does leave eventually? What if he doesn't? Miss Doris countered. What if this is the beginning of something wonderful? Are you really willing to sacrifice that possibility because you're afraid of the pain that might come with it? Audrey looked up at the older woman, at the wisdom in her eyes that spoke of experiences both bitter and sweet. He's already gone. Charleston isn't the moon, dear. It's a 2-hour drive. Miss Doris moved toward the door. The question is, what are you going to do about it? After she left, Audrey sat motionless, Miss Doris's words echoing in her mind. The wall she'd built around her heart hadn't protected her from pain. They'd only kept her from experiencing anything fully, good or bad. She'd come to Palmar Island to find herself, but perhaps finding herself meant discovering she didn't want to be alone anymore. Her gaze fell on a piece of driftwood she'd brought back from the beach, now sitting on her windowsill. The thing that had caused her fall. The thing that had brought Harrison into her life. Slowly, she turned back to her laptop, to the scene she'd been struggling with for days. The moment when her lighthouse keeper had to decide whether to remain in his solitary tower or risk venturing back into the world he'd left behind. Her fingers began to move across the keys, words flowing as the scene unfolded. Not the ending she'd originally planned, but the one she now realized was inevitable. Daniel stood at the railing, watching the ship approach. For years, he'd been content to guide others from a distance, to be the light that showed the way without ever joining the journey. But as he watched her ship draw nearer, he realized with sudden clarity that some journeys couldn't be made alone. That sometimes, the bravest thing wasn't staying at your post, but daring to leave it behind for something uncertain but infinitely more real. She continued typing, scene unfolding into scene as her lighthouse keeper left his tower, choosing connection over isolation, possibility over fear. When she finally typed the last sentence, she sat back, a strange sense of lightness filling her chest. The realization came with perfect clarity. She'd been so focused on finding herself after a lifetime of caring for others that she'd forgotten one essential truth. Finding yourself sometimes meant finding your way to someone else. Her lighthouse keeper had found his courage. It was time she found hers. With sudden determination, she reached for her phone, scrolling through her brief list of contacts until she found Harrison's number. Her thumb hovered over it for a moment, then moved to text instead. Some things were better said in person. Where are you staying in Charleston? She typed, then backspaced. Too demanding. I need to talk to you. She deleted that too. Too vague. Finally, she settled on the truth. I was wrong. I'm scared, but I don't want you to go. Can we talk? She pressed send before she could change her mind, her heart pounding as she watched the message delivered. 1 minute passed. 2. No response. Maybe he'd turned off his phone. Maybe he didn't want to hear from her. Maybe it was already too late. Chapter 10. Harrison drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, the familiar curve of the Pelican Inn's driveway coming into view. 2 hours of driving toward Charleston, and another 2 hours back, had given him plenty of time to think, but little clarity. One thing he knew for certain. Leaving without a proper goodbye had been a mistake. Whether or not Audrey wanted more between them, they deserved a better ending than angry words and a hasty retreat. The afternoon sun filtered through the oak branches as he parked and cut the engine. For a moment, he just sat there, trying to gather his thoughts. What would he say to her? What could he say that he hadn't already said? With a deep breath, he stepped out of the truck and made his way toward the inn. The wraparound porch welcomed him like an old friend as he climbed the steps, the wood creaking familiarly beneath his feet. He'd just reached the top step when the screen door swung open. Audrey stood in the doorway, car keys in hand, her expression transforming from determination to shock. Harrison, she said, his name little more than a breath. Audrey. He stopped, momentarily frozen by the sight of her. I was coming back, she finished, her voice catching slightly. He nodded, taking a tentative step forward. I got almost to Charleston and realized I didn't want to leave things the way we did. I was coming to find you. She held up her keys as if offering proof. I messaged you. Something unfurled in Harrison's chest, a tightness he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. You did? Yes. She took a step toward him, closing the distance between them. I was wrong, Harrison. I got scared and pushed you away, and I'm still scared, but. She took a shaky breath. I'm more scared of never knowing what might have been. Harrison felt his pulse quicken. What changed your mind? I finished writing a scene I'd been struggling with, she said, a small smile touching her lips. My lighthouse keeper. He finally realized that guiding others to safety isn't the same as finding your own way home. The words hit with unexpected precision. And did he? Find his way home? He's trying, she said softly. It turns out it's more of a journey than a destination. Harrison moved closer, until they stood just inches apart. I'd like to be part of that journey. If you'll have me. Audrey's eyes met his, vulnerable but steady. I'd like that too. I can't promise I won't be difficult sometimes. Old habits and all that. I can be pretty stubborn myself, he admitted with a small smile. We're quite a pair, aren't we? She laughed softly, the sound warming him from the inside. A retired firefighter who doesn't know how to stop rescuing people and a librarian who's afraid to write her own story. Maybe we can help each other figure it out. Harrison's hand lifted to her face, gently tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. This time, she didn't pull away. Instead, Audrey leaned into his touch, her eyes never leaving his. I'd like to try, she whispered. The invitation in her words was unmistakable. Harrison's heart hammered against his ribs as he slowly bent his head toward hers, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. She didn't. Instead, her eyes fluttered closed, her face tilting up to meet his. Their lips met softly at first, a gentle press that sent a current of warmth spreading through his entire body. The scent of her enveloped him. Something floral and subtle, like jasmine warmed by sunlight. Her lips were impossibly soft against his, tentative but yielding. Harrison's hand moved to cradle the nape of her neck, feeling the silky texture of her hair between his fingers. His other arm circled her waist, drawing her closer until he could feel the warmth of her body against his, the slight curve of her waist beneath his palm. Audrey made a small sound in the back of her throat, something between a sigh and a murmur, and the vibration of it against his lips sent a shiver down his spine. Her hands, which had been resting lightly on his chest, slowly slid upward to his shoulders, then around his neck, her touch gaining confidence with each passing moment. The world around them seemed to fade, the creaking of the porch beneath their feet, the distant sound of waves, the afternoon sunlight warming their skin, all of it receding as they found each other in this moment they'd both been moving toward since that first morning on the beach. When they finally broke apart, Harrison kept his arms around her, unwilling to let this moment end too quickly. Audrey's eyes opened slowly, their green depths holding a mixture of wonder and quiet joy that he felt echoed in his own heart. Her cheeks were flushed, her lips slightly parted, and Harrison couldn't help thinking she'd never looked more beautiful. I've been wanting to do that since the lighthouse tour, he admitted. Me too, she confessed. I just didn't know how to let myself want it. The screen door creaked open behind them, and they turned to find Elise watching with undisguised delight. I was wondering where you'd gotten to, Audrey. I see you won't be needing those hotel recommendations after all. Audrey blushed, but didn't move from Harrison's side. No, I don't think so. Harrison cleared his throat. Actually, I was wondering if my room might still be available. Elise winced apologetically. I'm sorry, Harrison. Someone checked in this morning. But, her expression brightened, I do have another room available. Right across from the Magnolia Suite, as it happens. How convenient, Audrey murmured, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Very, Harrison agreed, his arm sliding around her waist. I'll take it. The evening settled over Palmar Island like a gentle sigh, stars appearing one by one in the darkening sky. On the wraparound porch of the Pelican Inn, the string lights had been turned on, casting a warm glow over the gathering. Harrison sat beside Audrey on the porch swing, their shoulders touching, a simple point of connection that felt both new and somehow familiar. Across from them, Elise and Jacob occupied the wicker chairs, wine glasses in hand. The conversation had flowed easily through dinner, served right there on the porch at Audrey's request, and now continued in the comfortable aftermath, the empty plate stacked neatly on the side table. I can't remember the last time we had an impromptu dinner party, Elise said, leaning back in her chair. We should do this more often. Especially when there's something to celebrate, Jacob added, raising his glass in their direction. Harrison felt a pleasant warmth that had nothing to do with the mild evening air. He'd spent the afternoon moving his things into his new room, and each time they'd passed in the hallway, exchanged glances, or brushed hands, the reality of their new beginning had settled more firmly into place. So, Jacob said, breaking into Harrison's thoughts, what's next for the two of you? Harrison glanced at Audrey, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. Well, I've been thinking about staying on the island for a while, he said, the idea becoming more concrete as he spoke it aloud. I was originally just passing through, but now you have a reason to stay, Elise finished, her smile knowing. More than one, actually. Harrison set his wine glass down. I've been considering getting back to what I'm good at. Working with my hands. Not firefighting, obviously, but there's plenty of old buildings on this island that could use someone who knows their way around a toolbox. A handyman? Jacob asked, interest clear in his voice. Something like that. Harrison's gaze moved briefly to the inn's porch ceiling, to the original beadboard that had been carefully maintained over decades. I've always appreciated a sense of community. Folks around here would love that, Elise said. They're always looking for people who restore rather than rebuild. And what about you, Audrey? Jacob asked. Will you be heading back to Ohio once your novel is finished? Harrison felt a moment of tension, realizing they hadn't actually discussed this part yet. Everything was still so new, so fragile. I'm not sure, Audrey said thoughtfully, her shoulder warm against his. I've been thinking a lot about what comes next. I still have about 2 months left on my stay here to finish the novel, but after that. She paused, her fingers fidgeting slightly with the stem of her glass. I've been considering my options. Options are good, Elise said diplomatically, though Harrison caught the glance she exchanged with Jacob. The truth is, Audrey continued, her voice growing more confident, I didn't really have anything to go back to in Ohio. I sold my mother's house after she passed. My job at the library has already been filled. I came here to find myself, and I think. Her hand found Harrison's, her fingers intertwining with his. I think maybe I've found more than I was looking for. The simple honesty of her words touched something deep in Harrison's chest. He squeezed her hand gently, a wordless affirmation. Well, we'd be happy to have both of you stick around, Jacob said, raising his glass again. To new beginnings. And second chances, Elise added. And finding home in unexpected places, Audrey said softly, her eyes meeting Harrison's. He lifted his glass with his free hand, unwilling to let go of hers. I'll drink to that. As the conversation shifted to lighter topics, the upcoming island festival, Elise's plans for the garden, a fishing trip Jacob was organizing, Harrison found himself settling into a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. Not since before his heart problems, before his retirement, before the slow unraveling of his identity that had sent him wandering. Later, as the night deepened and Elise and Jacob excused themselves to clean up the dinner dishes, Harrison and Audrey remained on the porch swing, gently rocking in companionable silence. The distant sound of waves provided a rhythmic backdrop to their thoughts. Did you mean what you said? Audrey asked finally. About staying on the island? I did, Harrison replied, his arm now draped comfortably around her shoulders. I've been drifting for months, trying to figure out what comes next. Maybe it's time to put down some roots again. Because of me? Her voice held a note of uncertainty. Harrison considered this, wanting to give her an honest answer. You're part of it, he admitted. A big part. But it's also about finding something that matters again. This place, Palmar Island, it's something special. He smiled. And the fact that it would keep me close to you? That's not exactly a hardship. Audrey's soft laugh warmed him. So we're really doing this? Seeing where this goes? One day at a time, he said, turning to face her more fully. No pressure. No expectations. Just exploring the possibility. I'd like that. She leaned into him slightly. I've spent most of my life making safe choices. Maybe it's time to try something a little riskier. Like falling for a man you've known less than a month? Like falling for a man who carries women off beaches and fixes things without being asked, she corrected, her tone teasing but her eyes serious. A man who makes me want to be braver than I am. Harrison brushed a strand of hair from her face, marveling at how natural it felt to touch her this way. You're plenty brave already. Coming here alone. Starting over. Writing your story. Our stories, she amended softly. I think they might be intertwined now. The porch light cast a gentle glow over her features, highlighting the fine lines around her eyes that spoke of years lived and experiences weathered. In that moment, Harrison couldn't imagine wanting anything more than this. The simple perfection of sitting beside someone who understood what it meant to rebuild yourself from the ground up. I'd like that, he said, echoing her earlier words. Very much. Epilogue. Palmar Island, 3 months later. Audrey sat cross-legged in the window seat of the Magnolia Suite, laptop balanced on her knees, the cursor blinking at the end of her manuscript. The late September sunshine streamed through the windows, warming her shoulders as she read the final paragraph one more time. As Daniel descended the lighthouse steps for the last time, he didn't look back. The beam would continue its sweep across the water, guiding others to safety, but his own journey was taking him somewhere new. Somewhere he'd never expected to find himself, toward love, toward home, toward the greatest adventure of all. With a deep breath, Audrey clicked send, watching the email disappear into the digital ether. Just like that, after decades of dreaming, months of writing, and countless revisions, her novel was on its way to her agent. Done? Harrison's voice came from the doorway, where he leaned against the frame, tool belt slung low on his hips. Audrey looked up, a smile spreading across her face. Done. Just send it to Maggie. Congratulations. He crossed the room, bending to kiss her softly. He smelled of sawdust and the faint hint of lemon polish. Remnants of his morning spent repairing bookshelves at the island library. How does it feel? Terrifying, she admitted. Exhilarating. Like I've jumped off a cliff and haven't hit the water yet. Harrison laughed, the sound warm and familiar. Over the past 3 months, they'd settled into a rhythm that felt both comfortable and exciting. Harrison divided his time between odd jobs around the island and helping Jacob with the inn's ongoing renovations. Audrey worked on her novel and occasionally contributed book reviews to the local paper. This calls for a celebration, Harrison said, taking her laptop and setting it aside. Get your sweater. I have something to show you. What is it? Audrey asked, rising from her seat. Harrison's smile was enigmatic. You'll see. An hour and a short boat ride later, they stood at the base of the island's lighthouse, its red and white stripes gleaming in the afternoon sun. Audrey looked at Harrison questioningly. You said your novel needed a better ending, he reminded her. I thought this might help with inspiration for the sequel. How did you arrange this? Audrey asked as he produced a key to the normally locked door. Private tours aren't even offered anymore. Harrison's smile was tinged with satisfaction. Fixed the Historical Society president's back steps last week. He owed me a favor. They climbed the spiral staircase together, the familiar soft ache in Audrey's ankle a distant memory now. Harrison led the way, pausing occasionally to point out interesting architectural details. The craftsmanship of the curved walls, the ingenious ventilation system, the perfect balance of the structure. When they reached the top, Audrey gasped. The view was spectacular. The island spread beneath them, the ocean stretching to the horizon, and the Pelican Inn visible in the distance, its white clapboard gleaming in the sun. Now I understand why my lighthouse keeper was so reluctant to leave his post, she said softly. It's like being on top of the world. Harrison moved to stand beside her at the railing, his arm sliding naturally around her waist. Worth the climb? Absolutely. She leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his body against hers. The past 3 months had changed them both. Harrison was more settled, more at peace with his new direction. Audrey felt more confident, more willing to reach for what she wanted. Together, they'd found a balance neither had expected. "You know," Harrison said, his voice taking on an unusual note of hesitation, "I've been thinking about something you wrote. About how finding your way home isn't a destination but a journey." "Something like that," she agreed, turning to face him. "Why?" Harrison took both her hands in his. "Because I think I've found my way home, Audrey. And it's not a place. It's you." Her heart began to beat faster as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "Harrison. I know it hasn't been long," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "But when you've been lost for a while, you recognize home when you find it." He opened the box to reveal a simple ring with a single pearl. "I found it in a shop here on the island. I've been carrying it around for weeks, waiting for the right moment. I thought, maybe, when you finished your book." Audrey's vision blurred with unexpected tears. "You remembered." "Of course I did." His smile was tender. "That was the goal you set for yourself when you came here. To write your story. And now that you have." He took a deep breath. "Audrey Whitaker, would you consider writing our next chapter together? Will you marry me?" The sun dipped lower on the horizon, illuminating the island and Pelican Inn in a golden glow. Audrey thought of the months she'd spent on the island, of the woman she'd been when she arrived, afraid to reach for happiness, afraid to want too much. How far she'd come. How far they both had. "Yes," she said, the word carrying all the certainty she felt. "Yes, I will." As Harrison slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into his arms for a kiss that promised a lifetime of tomorrows, Audrey thought of her lighthouse keeper and his journey toward home. Sometimes the best stories were the ones you never saw coming. The ones that began with a simple fall and ended with the greatest adventure of all. Not the end, but the beginning. Bonus epilogue. Palmar Island, 1 year later. Audrey stood at the window of the Magnolia Suite, watching sunlight dance across the garden below. The hydrangeas were in full bloom, their blue and purple heads nodding in the gentle June breeze, and the climbing roses along the garden wall had opened their petals to the early summer warmth. White chairs had been arranged in neat rows on the lawn, a simple arch of greenery and white flowers marking the spot where, in just over an hour, she would become Harrison's wife. Wife. The word still caught her by surprise sometimes, like a plot twist she hadn't seen coming in her own story. Nervous? Elise appeared in the doorway, a vision in pale blue silk, a small bouquet of fresh flowers in her hands for Audrey's hair. Strangely, no. And it was true. At 50, Audrey had thought herself long past the age of wedding jitters. What she felt instead was a quiet certainty, a deep-rooted peace that seemed to hum beneath her skin. "I think I've finally outgrown the fear of making the wrong choice." Elise smiled, setting the flowers on the dressing table. "That's one of the benefits of finding love later in life, I suppose. You know yourself well enough to recognize the real thing when it finally appears." Audrey nodded, turning from the window to the simple ivory dress laid across the bed. Not quite white, she wasn't pretending to be a blushing young bride, but elegant in its simplicity, with delicate beading at the neckline and a flowing skirt that would catch the breeze just so. Beside it lay her novel, bound in hardcover, its jacket gleaming in the morning light, The Lighthouse Keeper's Return by Audrey Whitaker. She picked it up, running her fingers over the embossed letters of her name. The book had exceeded all her expectations. It wasn't a bestseller, but a solid mid-list debut that had earned respectable reviews and a small but enthusiastic readership. More importantly, it had given her the confidence to begin work on the sequel, which now filled her mornings with purpose and joy. "Your daughter-in-law-to-be is downstairs, by the way," Elise said, beginning to arrange the flowers carefully into Audrey's upswept hair. "She just arrived from the airport. Jacob's showing her to her room." "Melissa's here already?" Audrey felt a flutter of anticipation. Though she and Harrison's daughter had spoken several times by phone and video chat over the past year, they'd only met in person twice. Once during a brief visit last Christmas, and again 2 months ago when Melissa had flown in for a long weekend. Their relationship was still new, still finding its footing, but she had been surprisingly welcoming of Audrey in her father's life. A soft knock at the door was followed by the appearance of a young woman with Harrison's blue eyes and determined chin. "Is this where the bride's hiding out?" "Melissa." Audrey moved to embrace her, breathing in the faint scent of travel and unfamiliar perfume. "You made it. Wouldn't miss it for the world." Melissa stepped back, her gaze sweeping over Audrey with warm appreciation. "You look beautiful." "Dad's going to be speechless." "That would be a first," Audrey laughed, gesturing for her to sit. "I don't think I've ever known your father to be at a loss for words." "You'd be surprised." Melissa settled into the window seat, the same spot where Audrey had sat finishing her novel a year ago. "He gets all tongue-tied when he talks about you. It's actually kind of adorable." The thought of Harrison, steady, capable Harrison, being flustered by his feelings for her made Audrey's heart expand with tenderness. She turned back to the mirror, watching as Elise pinned the last flower into place. "I brought something for you," Melissa said, reaching into her purse. "Dad mentioned you were looking for something borrowed." She held out a delicate silver bracelet, a charm in the shape of a book dangling from its links. "My mom gave this to me when I graduated high school. I thought it might be nice for you to wear it today. Given your book and everything." The gesture, unexpected and deeply touching, brought sudden tears to Audrey's eyes. "Melissa, I couldn't." "Please," the young woman insisted, her expression earnest. "It would mean a lot to me. And to Dad." Audrey hesitated, then extended her wrist, allowing Melissa to fasten the bracelet around it. The weight of it felt significant. Not just the silver links, but the acceptance they represented. The blessing. "Thank you," she said softly. "For this." "For everything." Melissa's smile was unpracticed but genuine. "Just make him happy, okay? He deserves it. You both do." Another knock interrupted the moment, and Miss Doris appeared, her silver hair arranged in an elegant updo, a smudge of flour somehow still visible on one cheek despite her formal attire. "The cake is safely installed," she announced, as if reporting on a military operation. "And if Jacob so much as breathes on those sugar flowers before the reception, I'll skin him alive." Her sharp eyes softened as she took in Audrey. "Well now, don't you look like something straight out of a storybook?" "I feel a bit like I'm in one," Audrey admitted. Still not quite believing this is real. "Oh, it's real all right," Miss Doris said with a knowing smile. "I knew it from the moment he carried you in from that beach. Some things you just know." She checked her watch. 20 minutes, ladies. I'll go make sure the groom isn't pacing a hole through the porch boards." As she bustled out, Elise stepped back to survey her handiwork. "Perfect," she pronounced. "Now for the finishing touches." The next 15 minutes passed in a blur of final preparations. The simple veil settled carefully over Audrey's hair. The bouquet of white roses and baby's breath placed in her hands. A few last-minute adjustments to the drape of her dress. Through it all, a sense of wonder continued to build within her, like the rising tide. How strange life was, how full of unexpected turns. 3 years ago, she'd been alone in Ohio, caring for her ailing mother, her dreams of writing deferred for so long they'd nearly withered. Now here she was, a published author about to marry a man who had quite literally swept her off her feet on a beach she'd never expected to visit. "It's time," Elise said softly, peering out the window. "Everyone's seated. Harrison's waiting under the arch with the Reverend." Audrey took a deep breath, suddenly aware of her heartbeat, strong and steady in her chest. "All right then," she said, smoothing a hand over her dress. "Let's not keep him waiting any longer." The walk from the inn to the garden felt both endless and far too short. At Elise's suggestion, they circled around to approach from the side, avoiding the guests' view until the last moment. Melissa had gone ahead to take her seat in the front row, and now only Elise remained at Audrey's side, squeezing her hand once before stepping back. "Ready?" she asked. Audrey nodded, unable to speak past the emotion swelling in her throat. The music began, not the traditional wedding march, but a gentle melody that reminded her of waves lapping at the shore. As she rounded the corner of the hedge, the small gathering came into view. There were familiar faces from around the island, a few fellow writers she'd met through her book, and Jacob standing near the front with a grin that threatened to split his face. And there, beneath the arch of flowers, stood Harrison. His eyes found hers immediately, and the rest of the world seemed to fall away. He wore a simple suit in deep blue, a white rose in his lapel, and the expression on his face as he watched her approach was one of such profound joy that Audrey felt her own happiness mirror it, expanding until she thought she might float right off the ground. Step by step, she moved toward him, toward the future they would build together. When she reached his side, he took her hand, his fingers warm and solid around hers. "Hi," he whispered, the word barely audible over the final notes of the music. "Hi yourself," she whispered back, suddenly shy despite the journey that had brought them here. The Reverend began to speak, words about love and commitment flowing around them, but Audrey found herself focused instead on the feel of Harrison's hand in hers, on the steady rise and fall of his chest as he breathed, on the way the sunlight caught the silver at his temples. This man who had taught her that it was never too late to begin again, to risk her heart, to find home in another person's arms. When the time came for their vows, Harrison turned to face her fully, his blue eyes serious and tender. "Audrey," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his face. "For 30 years, I ran toward danger while others ran away. I thought that was bravery. But the bravest thing I've ever done was letting myself fall in love with you." He squeezed her hands gently. "You walked into my life, or rather, fell into it, when I was lost, when I'd forgotten who I was beyond what I did for a living. You reminded me that we are more than our jobs, more than our pasts, more than the roles we play for others." He paused, taking a breath, and Audrey could see the sheen of tears in his eyes matching her own. "I promise to be your partner in all things. To support your dreams as you've supported mine. To build a life with you that's both shelter and adventure. And to remind you, every day, that home isn't a place. It's wherever we are together." The words, so simple and yet so profound, settled around Audrey's heart like a blessing. When it was her turn to speak, she found her voice steadier than she'd expected. "Harrison," she said, the name itself a kind of prayer. "I spent my life helping others find their stories, never quite believing I had one worth telling myself. Then you appeared on that beach like something out of a novel I didn't realize I was writing." A smile curved her lips at the memory. "You taught me that it's never too late to turn the page, to start a new chapter. That the most beautiful stories are often the ones we never saw coming." She looked up into his beloved face, memorizing every line, every plane, every expression. "I promise to be your safe harbor and your greatest adventure. To walk beside you through whatever storms may come. To believe in us, in this unlikely, wonderful love we've found." Her voice dropped to a near whisper. "And to never forget that sometimes, the most extraordinary journeys begin with a simple fall." The exchange of rings was a blur of emotion and shining gold. And when the Reverend finally pronounced them husband and wife, Harrison's kiss was both familiar and new, a promise and a fulfillment all at once. As they turned to face their small gathering of loved ones, hands clasped tightly between them, Audrey caught sight of her book in the hands of one of the guests. Her story, bound and shared with the world. Just as she herself had finally, wonderfully, learned to be. Harrison squeezed her hand, and together they took their first steps down the petal-strewn path, into the future they would write together. Harrison stood at the edge of the wraparound porch, a glass of champagne cooling in his hand as he watched his wife laughing with a small group of guests in the garden below. The setting sun cast everything in amber light, from the white folding chairs still arranged on the lawn to the string lights that had just begun to twinkle overhead. "Wife." The word settled in his chest like an anchor, grounding him to this moment, to this place, to the life he'd never imagined for himself. Audrey wore her ivory dress with an easy grace, her hair slightly looser now as the evening progressed, a few wayward curls escaping to frame her face. She was speaking animatedly to a woman Harrison recognized as a local bookstore owner and one of the first to host a signing for Audrey's novel. Beside them stood a younger couple, the woman holding a copy of The Lighthouse Keeper's Return as if it were a precious artifact rather than a book. "She's a natural," Melissa said, appearing at his side with her own glass of champagne. Hard to believe she was ever nervous about the public parts of being an author. Harrison smiled, thinking of the woman who'd once been so fiercely independent she'd refused his help on the beach despite a sprained ankle. "She's always been stronger than she gives herself credit for." "Like someone else I know," his daughter replied, bumping her shoulder gently against his. The past year had brought changes for all of them. His relationship with Melissa had deepened, the distance that had grown during his years in the fire service gradually closing as they found new ways to connect. She'd visited the island several times now, each stay longer than the last, each departure a little harder. "I've been meaning to tell you," Melissa said, her gaze following his to where Audrey now bent to speak with one of the island children who'd served as an impromptu flower girl. "I'm proud of you, Dad." Harrison turned to look at his daughter, surprised by the emotion in her voice. "For what?" "For this." She gestured to encompass the inn, the gathering, the life he'd built. "For starting over. For being brave enough to change." She paused, meeting his eyes directly. "And for finding someone who makes you so happy. After Mom and I left, I worried about you. But seeing you here, with Audrey, with this whole community." She smiled, a woman now rather than the teenage girl who'd watched her parents' marriage crumble. "You've built something really special." The simple acknowledgement touched something deep in Harrison's chest. "Thank you," he said quietly. "That means more than you know." Before Melissa could respond, a distinct chiming sound cut through the general murmur of conversation. Jacob stood on the porch steps, glass raised, calling for attention. "If I could have everyone's attention for just a moment," he began, his gaze seeking out Harrison and Audrey among the guests. "I've been asked to say a few words about our newlyweds." Audrey made her way to Harrison's side, slipping her hand into his with the easy familiarity that still, after a year together, sent a current of warmth through him. Her fingers were cool against his palm, her wedding band still unfamiliar against his skin. "When Harrison Tate checked into the Pelican Inn a year ago, I pegged him as just another visitor passing through," Jacob continued, his expression warm with affection. "3 days max, I told Elise. The restless ones never stay." A ripple of knowing laughter moved through the gathering. "And when Audrey arrived not long after, focused entirely on finishing her novel, I was certain these two would barely cross paths." Jacob's smile widened. "Shows what I know." He raised his glass higher. "What I've learned from watching them find each other is that sometimes, the most unexpected guests become family. Sometimes the passing visitor puts down roots. And sometimes, a simple fall on the beach changes everything." The guests raised their glasses, the sunset catching in the crystal, scattering light like stars. To Harrison and Audrey, Jacob concluded. "May your journey together be as beautiful as the stories you inspire in each other." To Harrison and Audrey. The response echoed across the garden. As Harrison took a sip of his champagne, he caught sight of Miss Doris emerging from the inn, her face alight with anticipation. "And now," she announced, her voice carrying despite her diminutive stature, "I believe it's time for the cake." Two of Harrison's assistants from his handyman business, Josh and Tyler, local boys he'd hired when the demand for his services had outgrown his ability to keep up, carefully carried the 3-tiered masterpiece from the kitchen to the table set up on the lawn. Miss Doris followed, directing their movements with the precision of a battlefield general. "Easy now," she cautioned as they set it down. "Those sugar flowers took me 3 days." The cake was, indeed, a work of art. 3 round tiers covered in smooth white frosting, decorated with delicate sugar flowers that matched the garden blooms. And perched on top, a small lighthouse crafted from fondant and gum paste, its light seemingly illuminated by the golden sunset behind it. "Oh, Miss Doris," Audrey breathed, stepping closer to admire the creation. "It's absolutely perfect." The older woman's chest puffed with pride. Nothing less would do for you too, she said, though her gruff tone couldn't quite hide her pleasure at Audrey's reaction. Now come cut it before those sugar flowers wilt in this heat. The cake cutting was a joyful affair, with Harrison and Audrey managing to avoid the traditional smearing of frosting on each other's faces, much to Miss Doris's relief. As slices were distributed among the guests, soft music began to play from the speakers Jacob had set up around the garden. I believe, Harrison said, setting aside his empty plate, this is where I'm supposed to ask my wife to dance. Audrey's smile lit her face from within. I believe it is, husband. He led her to the small area cleared for dancing, the grass beneath their feet still warm from the day's sun. As he took her in his arms, the familiar scent of her perfume enveloped him. Jasmine and vanilla, the same scent that now lingered on his pillows, in his workshop, in all the corners of their life together. Happy? He asked softly as they began to move to the music. Completely, she replied, her head finding its familiar place against his shoulder. Though I still can't quite believe we're here. That this is real. Harrison understood the feeling. Even after a year of waking up beside her in their small cottage on the edge of town, of sharing meals and walks and the mundane rhythms of everyday life, there were still moments when the sheer improbability of their story struck him anew. Very real, he assured her, his hand splayed against the small of her back. Though I'll admit, there are days I feel like I'm living in one of your novels. Audrey laughed, the sound vibrating against his chest. Speaking of which, I had an idea for the sequel this morning. On our wedding day, he teased. Should I be worried about your priorities, Mrs. Tate? It's your fault, she countered, leaning back to look at him. Something you said last night, about how sometimes the most meaningful journeys happen after we think the story's over. Her eyes sparkled with creative energy. I think that's where my sequel begins. Not with my lighthouse keeper settling into domestic bliss, but with him and his new love discovering that finding each other was just the beginning of the adventure. Harrison spun her in a gentle turn, marveling at how perfectly she fit in his arms. I like it, he said. Though I might be biased, given that I'm living that particular story. The best research is lived experience, she agreed with a smile. As they continued to dance, other couples joined them on the makeshift dance floor, Jacob and Elise, their movements practiced and easy after years together, Melissa and one of the local men who'd been eyeing her all evening, even Miss Doris, coaxed into a tentative two-step by an elderly gentleman he didn't recognize. In the distance, the lighthouse was lit, the glow cutting through the gathering dusk. Harrison watched it over Audrey's shoulder, thinking of the metaphor that had brought them together. Of guiding lights and safe harbors, of journeys home. Later, as the celebration continued around them, Harrison leaned close to Audrey's ear. What do you say we slip away for a bit? There's somewhere I'd like to go. Her eyes met his, curious but trusting. Lead the way. They made their excuses to their guests, promising to return shortly, and slipped away from the inn's glowing warmth. Hand in hand, they walked the familiar path down to the beach, the same stretch of sand where they'd first met. The tide was low, the wet sand reflecting the rising moon in perfect silver circles. Feels like a lifetime ago, Audrey said as they reached the spot where she'd fallen. Me, sprawled in the sand with a twisted ankle. You, appearing out of nowhere to rescue me. I wasn't rescuing you, Harrison corrected gently. I was finding you. He drew her into his arms, the sound of waves providing a perfect counterpoint to the distant music from the reception. The end. This has been Love Takes a Tumble. Written by Susanne Ash. Copyright 2025 by Susanne Ash. Production copyright 2025 by Susanne Ash. Thanks for listening. Please like and subscribe if you want me to put more of my books on YouTube. Visit my website at www.susanneash.com for more of my books or find me on Amazon.